Chapter 10. A sword across the knee, a sword through the blood. Victims of the greats, ah. Ning looked at this scene and thought silently in his mind, but then he felt two condensing gazes coming from beside him, and turning his head to look, he found Sangsang looking at himself silently with her face turned sideways. Looking at each other for a second or two, usually short, at this time long. Once again in his life, Ning was defeated in front of his own little maid, sighing hopelessly in his heart, his leg muscles tightening slightly, his toes thrusting into the thick fallen leaves and into the slightly damp soil, ready to strike. In the distance, because the sun sets more and more gloomy deep in the North Mountain Road, those gray and black branches, suddenly from no reason to attack a gale, branches on the newborn shoots hidden in the protection of the old bark was not hurt. But the ground is not known how many years of leaves were rolled to the midair fluttering, rustling, and then have to fall. In springtime, the boundless fallen trees were falling. A man wearing dark light armor, stout figure appeared in the depths of the northern mountain road. With a thunderous bellow, a pale, earth-colored light seeped out of his body's light armor, flashing and passing, as if the god of the sky from the cloud had occasional glimpses. His two arms, as thick as a tree, were violently raised, turning a piece of heavy stone picked up from nowhere into a whistling stone bomb, violently smashing into the magnificent carriage. What a terrifying power that could turn a person into a long-range stone-throwing siege machine. Heavy stone whistling cracked the air at high speed. Halfway there is a branch touching a trace will be crushed, along an arc, unstoppable through the distance of hundreds of meters, accurate and cold hit the first carriages. Only heard a muffled sound, decorative ornate internal structure of the sturdy carriage suddenly scattered into a mass of waste wood and rags, inside the hidden limbs and blood. Has been holding the sword kneeling on one knee at the periphery of the carriage of the great Tang guard's expression remains indifferent, seemingly cannot see behind the carriage has turned into garbage, cannot see their sworn to protect Her Highness has been broken into pieces, their face is not even surprised look, but can even vaguely see a touch of relief and calm intention. Forefront, shoot! The chief of the guards let out a low shout. The three subordinates maintained a half-kneeling stance. Their right hands had long since let go of the hilts of their swords, and with the flat end of their powerful military crossbows, they aimed at the depths of the forest and swiftly keyed the triggers. 9 crossbow arrows shot through the slowly fluttering leaves like lightning, accurately hitting the body of that godlike man. However, that burly man only waved his hand, brushing away the 2 crossbow arrows that were attacking his face, and paying no attention to the crossbow arrows that hit his chest. The man's stone-like palms were shaken by the high-speed crossbow arrows, and the crossbow arrows on his chest were caught in his light armor, trembling twice like a long-legged insect that couldn't stand steadily before falling to the ground, with bloodstains on the tips of the arrows, probably only slightly injured. Because the distance is too far, this wave of crossbow arrows did not play any role other than the above effect. The chief of the guards was prepared for this, without the slightest change of expression on his face, looked at the tall figure standing deep in the North Mountain Road, raised his right hand and drank, "Stay." The 3 guards put down their bows and crossbows, and their right hands regained their grip on the hilts of their swords that were angled toward the sky. Because of Sangsang, Ning had intended to look for an opportunity to save the poor scapegoat in the carriage. However, the battle changed so quickly that he was completely too late to react, and that giant man of the heavenly gods appeared in front of everyone's eyes, and that heavy stone flew from the heavens, and the ornate carriage and the woman in it were reduced to a bloodied and fragmented piece of dust. Sympathize with the nameless woman, or feel as the master ashamed of the trust of the little maid. In any case, his gaze fell on the depths of the northern mountain road at this time, and his face was a bit ugly. Through the use of some kind of cultivation secret art, let that giant man has such a wild and incredible strength, but will weigh more than 1,000 pounds of boulders thrown out such a long distance, still let him pay a great price, only to see his face is a flushed, sweat slurry spray out of the arrow holes on the light armor, legs slightly trembling, even seems to have signs of disengagement. I don't know why, in the face of such a good opportunity, those dozen or so indifferent expression guards didn't choose to strike, but remained vigilant in guarding around the second carriage. The old man in the old robe sat on this carriage, his eyes still closed. Suddenly, the old man's florid white head started up, like a silver stream flowing nonstop in the dirty old robe, and the old sword, placed horizontally between his knees, began to buzz and chirp, and the sword inside the sheath kept bumping against the inner wall, seemingly impatient to come out of the world to drink blood. The urn. 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 Shine. A clear sound. The snowy short sword unsheathed itself and came out, and the old man's knee beside a steep cross turned into a light green sword light. Rolled leaves cracked the wind and went, silent, biting cold, straight stabbing the depths of the North Mountain Road, as if to penetrate the huge body of that heavenly godlike body. Between the last twilight and gloomy dense forest at the entrance of North Mountain Road, as if there was an invisible mirror, when the snowy short sword flew out from the sheath on the old man's knee and turned into a stream of light and went away, only to see that side of the dense forest there was a gray shadow with the body of the sword vaguely visible, whistling and coming. The light gray shadow like a shuttle, like electricity, a moment ago in the sky fluttering in the leaves, the next instant will come to the battlefield of the North Mountain Road killings, the beginning of the low humming in the blink of an eye, less than the time period, into the wind and thunder like roar. The gray shadow's speed was extremely fast, and the might it carried directly shattered all the leaves within a few feet of its surroundings, and the shredded leaves like silk and fluff dragged into a straight line behind the shadow. And at the end of the line was the old man, who no longer had a sword on his knee. Great Sword Master. Looking at the gray shadow that had become the wind and thunder, the guards who had always stood by calmly like stone statues finally changed slightly, and someone shouted out a warning. When his side's most powerful old man hands, sword out of the old sheath on the knee straight to the forest depths of the giant man, has been hidden until now, the enemy's strongest person also finally showed traces. Once appeared is the wind and thunder big movement. In the Empire, the other side, in order to assassinate the princess, actually deployed two beyond the mortal world power of the cultivators, and even deployed a great swordsmith. This fact makes the crowd feel a little shudder. However, the guard still cannot see the slightest bit of timidity on the face, only the absolute emotion. The leader of the guards broke off and shouted, "Chop! Shine, shine, shine!" A series of intensive blade sheathing sound, continuous ringing, dozens of sharp steel blade with a one-way momentum determination, accompanied by the guard's full force lightly exhale turbid sound. One knife to the front of the open area, chopping, swish, 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 swish. Every blade light is so powerful and strong, cutting through the air, cutting through the intended hills, forming a dense weaving network of knives, protecting the old man without a sword on his knees tightly in it. High-speed shuttle gray shadow swept to the knife array before, looked to be chopped down by those harsh knife power, but steeply in midair made a strange pause, and then sideways a circle, marvelously avoid the knife array set of blade direction, snorting sound fly away. Appeared in the North Mountain Road in the dense forest of the moment, it has become the wind and thunder of the situation, seemingly irresistible, however, who did not expect, after entering the real battle, that gray shadow even go is the spirit of the strange situation. Such as shuttle gray shadow turned that instant, the speed dropped sharply, finally able to vaguely see its body, as if a very thin and very dull sword shadow seems to casually a gust of wind will be able to blow it out of the sky and clouds to go. Such a piece of thin as cicada wings, give a person the feeling is not harder than a piece of paper sword shadow, trajectory is elusive, agile as a ghost, and the snorting sound steering away from the process of turning, sticking to a guard's blade of lightning on the disappearance, wiped through his jaw, leaving a faint blood scar. The next moment the faint blood scar rapidly expanded, blood wildly sprayed out, this guard right hand carrying the knife, left hand dead cover his neck, blood from the fingers wildly overflow, angry eyes staring at the depths of the forest, slowly leaning forward to fall, until the moment of death he still did not see that powerful sword master. Gray sword shadow in the air drew a rounded arc, lightning-like again swept back before the sword array, swiftly in the front, swiftly in the back. The trajectory is unpredictable, cannot be captured, in an instant there are two more guards were killed. Blood beads in the air slowly floating down, the chief of the guard's expression cold calm, both hands tightly grip the slender hilt of the sword, staring at the gray shadow of the sword, suddenly left foot forward, waist and abdomen suddenly force, blade diagonally downward lightning cleave, at the same time bellowed, together. Along with this sword array command, his body in front of and behind the four waiting for the opportunity has been a long time behind the guards, and the hands of the steel sword dance into snowflakes, the gray light sword shadow hard forced into a narrow space. And that space will immediately be the chief of the guards to condense all the essence of the diagonal blade broken. The gray shadow of the sword was so fast that it was about to be chopped by the blade, but it forced a pause in the very small space. The leader of the guards was prepared for this, only to hear a muffled grunt. His left hand gripped the end of the hilt of the long blade and forced it down. The blade that was chopping diagonally downwards buckled lightning-like, just hitting the sword shadow. With a slight muffled sound, the agile gray sword image fell to the dust like a thin snake that had been struck in its 7 inches, falling into the thick fallen leaves and rotting mud. This was the first time since the engagement that the Great Tang Guard sword formation had hit the enemy Great Sword Master's sword image. However, no one cheered. To be precise, there was no time to cheer, because the dead leaves on the ground began to vibrate and arch violently, like a giant snake awakening and rapidly traveling under the guard's feet. As the dead leaves flew wet and muddy splashes, gray-black sword shadows shot up, penetrating like electricity, easily slashing through the cotton armor on the outside of one of the guard's thighs, cutting through an aorta that was fatal enough to kill. Suppressed muffled grunts resounded from time to time within the blade formation. The guards fell one after another, occasionally able to cut into the gray-pale sword shadow, but never able to completely chop it into a section of the dead. The expression of the chief of the guards gradually appeared the color of grief and indignation. In the atmosphere of suppressed sadness and melancholy, he stepped forward one more step. His hands gripped the hilt of the long blade horizontally and bellowed out a cry of chopping again. "Hop!" he roared sternly. The last surviving guards bellowed in unison, desperately lunging at the gray shadow, arranging a final barrier with their own bodies and the light of the swords in their hands. With 2 soft thuds, the bodies of the 2 guards fell to the ground breathlessly, and the earlobe of the leader of the guards was neatly sliced in half, with blood dripping down, and a few more drenching bloody slits on his body, like someone drunkenly letting loose with wild grass. That gray sword shadow was chopped by the guard's blades for the 7th time, and its speed had become much slower than at the very beginning, yet in the end it wasn't knocked down, vibrating and flying slowly. It broke through the blade formation and arrived in front of that old man in the old robe. At this time, the crowd finally saw the gray sword shadow clearly. It was a small sword without a handle. The dull sword body was extremely thin, without the slightest trace of blood remaining. The blood-soaked chief of the guards on the sword, kneeling on one knee, lowered his head and gritted his teeth unwillingly, thought, "Only a knife. Only a knife himself and his brothers will be able to complete this seemingly impossible task." However, the great swordsmith is still a great swordsmith after all. Seemingly long fighting process, in fact, but as the blade went several times harsh, sword shadow several times floating, blood several times spraying time just, and this process, sitting on the carriage of the old robes of the old man, since the knees of the sword flew away from the always closed eyes, as if not aware that they are in great danger. No one noticed that the old man's hands, gently hanging on his knees, were trembling slightly. The thumbs of both hands quickly pressed down on the 2 horizontal lines of the middle index finger, like a dragonfly pointing at the water with a single touch, seemingly carrying out some kind of extremely complex calculations. Just as the small handleless sword flew in front of him, less than a foot from his brow, the old man finally opened his eyes and looked over. At a glance, the small handleless sword hung in the air as if frozen, unable to move the slightest bit. Deep in the dense forest, the giant man, who was about to be forgotten by the crowd, looking at the wide palm of his hand between the snowy flying sword that he rubbed into a broken copper, stunned, finally guessed what was going on, raised his head and roared in panic, "He's not a swordsmith. He's in Yin division."